they're like, "You're adopted." I'm like, What? How? That's impossible." I mean, I really had no clue, and that was just absolutely shocking. I remember the next morning going to church and sitting around just being like, "Do people know?" It's like all over my face. I mean, I just felt this stress I had never felt before, and from that moment on, I really just never, and I don't know if I felt like I belonged or not before that, but clearly that I definitely did not feel like I fit in or belonged, and, so that kinda was the start of it, but you didn't talk about it, right?
Welcome to Small Acts of Rebellion, a podcast where the unspoken narratives at the intersection of our personal and professional lives come to light. I'm your host, Heather Pridemore, your guide on this journey of discovery and defiance. Join me as we uncover the rebellious spirit that shapes our careers and lives. It's time to own your story. Are you ready? Today's guest, Lori Evans Ermi, is an adoptee, adopter, stepdaughter, stepsister, half sister, stepmother, single mom, entrepreneur, and former corporate executive. Lori is also a professional certified coach with over 30 years of experience in corporate leadership and organizational development. Lori's latest work, the book Adoption Songs, delves into the unique challenges adoptees face, particularly the issue of belonging. In Adoption Songs, Lori brings awareness to adoption as a trauma condition and aims to inspire adoptees to search for their identity. The book explores the emotional and psychological complexities of adoption, offering insights and support for those dealing with adoption-related issues. Lori hopes her book will create meaningful conversations and help adoptees become more grounded, connected, and purposeful. Welcome to the show, Lori.
Thank you. It's so great to be here, Heather.
And I have to thank you. So I have an early copy of the book, which you signed, which was so sweet. I will cherish this for certain. And so I was really excited to get a chance to explore the book. But we just met recently. And so I thought it was worth just mentioning. You and I were actually introduced by Jesse Rember, who was a recent guest of the podcast, who also features a story in Adoption Songs. And so that is how you and I got connected.
Yes, Jesse and I have known each other since 2nd grade, so that was a couple of years ago. We were in fife and drum corps together, we were flautists together, although she was far better than I was, and yeah, and we connected years later. I was at a conference in Denver at least 10 years ago, I think, and so we had connected on, both having adopted children, and then when I got inspired to tell these stories that were just so amazing, she was generous enough to be willing to be a part of it, so
Well, and it's interesting to me too because you're both musical and then of course adoption songs, right? There's the musicality of the title and the playlist, and so there's this thread of music that kind of carries over between all the stories.
yeah, and that came about. My daughter, who's now 17, is very musical as well, and, we're kinda thinking adoption stories, we're playing with some titles, and then I'm like, "What about adoption songs?" And then people can pick a song that they resonate with for their particular journey and story. Jesse's, for instance, is Brave, and so then we're like, "Oh, we gotta make a playlist." So there is actually playlists on Spotify and Apple Music for adoption songs, so people can download that.
Well, we'll be sure to link that playlist in the show notes so that others can listen to it as well. Now, I thought it would make sense, Lori, for you to just begin by talking about the book. So, could you just tell me about adoption songs and what you hope readers are going to take away from it?
Yeah, so it's been a odd journey just from my own story of being an adoptee. I come from what they call the baby scoop era. That was the time between World War II and Roe versus Wade. So there were millions of, young birth moms who got pregnant, and that wasn't part of their family's story about how that was supposed to end up. And, a lot of relinquishment took place during that time. And, from what I know very little of, my birth mother fell right into that situation and, just was not able to have any other choices. Right. So that's a whole nother conversation. But as far as being adopted, we all were like, "Oh, we should be grateful. We have these wonderful families. We were kind of rescued, and we were able to complete somebody's dream of having a family." And that was about it. I mean, pretty much it was not anything you talked about. In fact, I didn't find out I was adopted till I was 8, and I was shocked. And that was really my first real memory of my identity being obliterated. I remember it vividly. It was a Saturday night. My parents we always would have like steak or something nice. And they're like, "Oh, we have to talk to you." And I'm like, "Okay, sure." And they're like, "Well, and they hedged and hawed. And then I'm noticing my anxiety just bubbling up. Like, what is going on? And I think I had just lost at least one grandparent or and an aunt, so had known some loss and grief. So it was kind of that energy that they were exhibiting. And they're like, "You're adopted." I'm like, "What? What? How? That's impossible." I mean, I really had no clue. And that was just absolutely shocking. I remember the next morning going to church and sitting around just being like, "Do people know?" It's like all over my face. I mean, I just felt this stress I had never felt before. And from that moment on, I really just never, and I don't know if I felt like I belonged or not before that, but clearly that I definitely did not feel like I fit in or belonged. And, so that kind of was the start of it, but you didn't talk about it. Right. And I meet adoptees now kind of from our same era, and we all relate to the exact same feeling. So fast forward a few years, I really wasn't interested in finding biological family. I really did have loving, wonderful parents, and I am grateful, as much as has now become a cliche in the adoption constellation. But I started to get a little curious as I got older and around health information. As I got older into my late 20s, having some health information and history was important. Oh, back up. My mom died when I was 16 of a heart attack in the middle of the night. No one knew. There was, I guess there was health history. Nobody put it together. So I kind of had that in the back of my mind too as I was getting older. And you're starting to adult and get doctors and all that. And they're like, "Oh, so what's your health history?" "I don't know. I'm adopted." "I don't know. I'm adopted." And you start hearing that over and over again. You're like, I really have no identity. I don't have any clue where I come from, what my foundations are. Yeah, again, another element that adoptees like all connect and resonate with that we weren't able to talk about. Right. So I got some non identifiable information, wasn't a whole lot. Fast forward, it turns out most of it wasn't even true. So that's another phenomenon that these agencies, kind of manufactured and crafted some stories of, that made it sound nice. The story that I heard from my parents is, "Oh, they were in college, but they just, couldn't afford to have a baby, but they loved you." All of that. Everybody has that same story, or a lot of us do. Well, that wasn't true at all. Later found out with Ancestry, found at the birth father family, which I never gave any thought to because it said in the non-identifiable information that the birth father had no idea I existed, and that was true. I did find birth mother on Ancestry, reached out to her through their portal this back in 2017, I guess, and sent her a few notes. "Thank you. I'm grateful. I did have a lovely life, and it had to be so hard. I can't imagine. Would love to connect with you." And she just wasn't able to respond. And you could tell that they read it because it says read, or whoever's managing her Ancestry account. So that was a little disappointing because, you're just always curious and wanting to know your roots and where you come from and what that would have been like. And do I look like anyone? I never knew anybody, in my that looked like me. I did meet a half sister. She did look like me. We were in a reunion for about 5 years, and, for whatever reasons, that just didn't work out. So, but it was, it's been a journey. So why this book? So I had all that going on, and then I met like 2 or 3 people back to back that were also adopted, and you just don't run into a lot of adopted people, or at least I didn't. And they suddenly just started showing up in my universe, and I was like, "Oh, am I supposed to write a book? These stories are amazing." So I talked to my daughter Kate, who was, I don't know, 12 at the time, and she goes, "Oh, that'd be really cool, mom." And then that's how we kind of birthed adoption songs. I just started reaching out to people, "Hey, would you be interested in sharing your story?" And I put them on Zoom and recorded it, and first started out with some summer interns because I knew I needed help because I'm working full time too. And then my stepdaughter, who's a beautiful writer and trained editor, actually needed a little side gig, so she joined the project about 3 years in and helped me get it over the finish line. So, I've got people from all walks of life, some people I didn't know that was like, "Hey, you should talk to so and so," and so that's been really great. So the underpinnings of all that, you could see trauma embedded in these stories, but I wasn't aware of that yet. When I was doing all these interviews, that was not something I was aware of. What I've since learned is I was living in the fog, which is, oh, adoption's beautiful and lovely, and I didn't really have any issues. Oh, yeah, I did. So I found a book called The Primal Wound. Nancy Verrier was written in the 90s, and I didn't know anything about it. And I can't even remember how I'd stumbled across it, but it described exactly what I'd been feeling for decades, where there's just, you're taken away from your birth mother immediately and handed to strangers. And as an infant or as a newborn, you're pre-verbal, but you still can see that that connection has been severed. So you're in fight or flight response from the beginning of your life, searching for, this human that you had been attached to, your whole life up until then. And as loving as these adopted parents that you end up with, or I was in their orphanage for a few weeks. I'm sure they were all trying to be nice to me and feed me and all that, but it's just not the same. So your very early, memories and beginnings are very stressful, and that gets into your DNA, it's cortisol is just shooting through you. So that's how you're dealing with things. So now they're able to connect that to attachment, anxious attachment styles, abandonment. A lot of adoptees, we sabotage our relationships because we kind of figure they're going to end anyway. So there's a guard and a trust issue. Now, lots of people have trauma, absolutely. But this is from like day one. So it is a little deeper. And there's just this feeling that you can't even really explain unless you're an adoptee. And once I, found this community, which now is huge and rolling, there's a massive wave. I call it a tsunami of adoptees just saying, wait, this is wrong. Adoption is not great for the adoptee. If there's at all a possibility to keep the family together, that's better, or at least adopted parents, you're all well meaning, make sure that you're getting some therapy because it's going to exist. You may not see it. Sadly, the research has shown that suicide rates are 4 times the national average for adoptees. Self-soothing and addiction is very common. So, you know, I got my daughter in therapy, last year. We went through a lot of changes in the last couple of years, went through a divorce, had to move. And so she had some trauma. She was handling it well. But I'm like, once I found out about this, I'm like, oh, let's get you some help now. Has made all the difference in the world. So if you can then have your own self-management strategies, right? Whether it's breathing techniques or meditation or whatever to help you calm that anxiety that you just didn't even know you had. But then once you can name it, of course, the saying is you can reframe it. And that's what I'm hoping this book can help really the mainstream see that adoption's not all roses and sunshine. There's a spectrum. One side of, the roses and sunshine, everybody should be grateful and what a beautiful thing adoption can be. Yes, it can be beautiful. And then there's more. The other side of the spectrum are adoptees who know about all this trauma early on. They're far wiser than I was. I was under a rock for a long, long time, and they're looking for adoption reform. Many want adoption abolished, which I don't think is going to happen, but at least, adoption songs, we're in the middle. We want to help inform and increase awareness so that it can be a conversation we're having and it's not shut down like, oh, everybody has trauma. Okay. And here's something that's a little different.
Laura, I want to ask you because as I talked to you before this conversation and as I read some of the content in adoption songs, there's definitely a strong theme of identity. And
Mm.
I actually marked a page. I'm just going to read one sentence that you had written here. You said, "What clues about your identity are hidden in the details of your family system?" And that really struck me. Without getting too much into my own story, my mom and dad separated when I was 4. And so there have always been my own questions of history and maybe belonging and just trying to understand some of the health stuff that you mentioned and understand my genealogy and all these things. And so while not adopted myself, I think I relate a little bit with aspects of that search for meaning and identity. But I felt like as I read, there was this larger overarching question of like, what is identity? Because even as you were telling your story about, you got to age 8 and then found out you were adopted, I wondered, like, what clues, now that you look back historically, were there about identity related to being adopted? And then what do you think about as far as, like, overarching, like, what is identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you went through trauma in your scenario, right? It might have happened at 4, but still, you didn't have the coping skills, available to you to help you, weather that storm. Now, of course, it probably helped make you resilient. Look at you now. This is an amazing podcast that really is about resilience. So, you're able to now, live that as a result of what you went through. Identity to me, and I'm not, a psychologist or, and I like to play one on TV occasionally, but it is being able to stand really grounded in who you are, what your gifts are, that you aren't comparing yourself to others, that you can just stand in confidence and knowing that but what you bring to the world is unique and yours, and that you can connect to some, you know, genetic frame of reference, right? I mean, it doesn't always have to be that way because, to be honest, I do feel like I hit the baby lottery with my adopted parents, and some do, some don't. So, and I respect that. But I still think that identity, if you're in a family where everybody looks like you, and even if everybody fights and they don't get along, I mean, that's your tribe. It's clear. I mean, I always gravitated towards families with large numbers of kids because I was fascinated by it, and they all looked alike, right? And you morph into that. Whether it's an identity you like or not is a whole nother story, but it's kind of built in. But like in your situation, you had a little abandonment. I mean, I don't know what the visitation was and all of that, but it was different than what you knew up until you were 4. So you had to, without a lot of skills, recreate who am I going to be now at 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. And sometimes, and I don't know if this was your case, but when you're younger and in schools, I mean, kids are cruel anyway. And if you are a little different, at least like divorce and stuff wasn't that common when I was growing up. And fortunately, my parents were happily married. But you I mean, I can imagine that was, you felt that, like, "Ooh, I'm now different in some way," and I don't know if we all have that strength and courage at those young ages to be able to say, "Yeah, different is great," and some people do, right? I was not that. I wanted to fit in. I was constantly looking to fit in. So for me, identity shifted based on the stage of life I was in. I always knew I wanted to be successful, and I had this image of a great career, and that came from my dad because that was him. I really admired him, and so I don't know. I think now is really when I'm finding my true identity for the first time because I recognize and I can self regulate some of this anxiety that I had been feeling all along. So I think, if you're centered and grounded and you've got a confidence and you're healthy emotionally, physically, mentally, that's when your true identity can emerge.
Lori, as you look back in that sort of knowledge of knowing you were adopted, are you able to now see some of the ramifications of that trauma as you look back in hindsight?
Oh, yeah. Well, another fact, I've not quite said all this out loud, but I'm out there, so I gotta start really being authentic about my story. A lot of adoptees are searching for love in all the wrong places, right? Trying to connect with, you know, in relationships. And I had fits and starts in trying to find love and try to feel like I belonged to someone. Now, I didn't want to belong like in an ownership standpoint, but I really was just always trying to look for that love and that connectivity and to have a partner to explore life with. And because I was a little damaged and didn't necessarily know it, I was searching again in all the wrong places. And so that didn't come easily to me. And then as I learned, lots of adoptees, especially women, struggled with that in their, early young adulthood. Then I'm twice divorced now, and adoptees tend to sabotage their relationships. We're gonna get dumped anyway, so we might as well have some control over that and do it to ourselves. And now I'm at least aware of that. So I've been dating and ugh, the cesspool of the dating world is not fun, but I'm very aware of noticing my anxiety. Like I try to, okay, take a break. You don't need to sweat this now. And also, I definitely drank a lot, had some recreational drug use throughout the years. I think I was lucky in that I knew where the breaks were, I knew the line not to cross, but that if you're hurt, hurt people, as they say, right? And if
Mhm.
you're numbing yourself, then it takes more and more to achieve that numbing, which is where addiction, falls into play. And could I have gone over the edge? Yeah, but I also had the identity in my mind that was planted early on by my, lovely parents that I'm gonna go to college, I'm gonna have a role, a job, I'm gonna, do something with my life, and I'm smart. I had good self-image growing up, which I was lucky, which not a lot of adoptees do, as I'm learning.
Now, Lori, as I was reading, one of the things I noticed was that to be clear, just so that I can be transparent, I read the 2 chapters that you wrote and the chapter that your daughter wrote, and of course the introduction. And so, kind of sampled the book in preparation for our conversation. And one of the themes that I noticed, and I'll be interested as I read the rest of it to see if I see this in other folks' stories, but there's a lot of reference to other people. And so I thought that was sort of interesting that when you think about, your search for self, and again, I identify a little bit with this and the fact that my dad left when I was little, that you search for aspects of, I guess, like almost that reflection of your identity in other people. And so there
Mm.
was a lot of mention of, like you said, looking like other people. There was references to just the different people that you met along your journey as far as like cousins and aunts and how all these other people become like pieces of a puzzle to some sort of bigger tapestry. And I just thought that was really interesting. I didn't know if you had noticed that, because I know you're also someone who identifies patterns. And so I didn't know if you had noticed that in your own reflection and also in the stories of others that you were able to take in.
Oh, that's really good. Not the way you have, and I love how you describe that, so I'll have to steal that later. For sure, I have been on this search to be connected to humans at some level. I mean, the work I do is very much that way as an executive coach, and but family, family is all. Plus, I'm a Cancer, my zodiac sign, which is all about home and family and connection, right? So just knowing that I struggled there, I had a very, very small family once my mom died, and my dad was remarried, and there was definitely I was not necessarily integrated into that, and I was older, went to college, so there wasn't a chance to really bond as a new step family anyway. But yeah, no, I love how you picked up on that, because I do think that we're always searching. And I think younger adoptees have well, it's a blessing and a curse, I suppose, with the DNA testing, because right, it's just so much easier to find family now. I mean, that was not even a thought, you know. There's also the downside of that. People don't want to be found necessarily, or oops, I didn't know that. Or then there's the NPEs, which is the non paternal event, or a not parent expected, which is a whole nother spectrum. You take your DNA test and you realize, oh, my dad was 100% German, my mother's 100% English, and I don't have any German at all. Mom, what's that about? Yeah, and that's a huge population. That's, or the fertility assisted, population where suddenly they realize they've got 100 siblings out there and didn't know, right? So I mean, there's it's complicated what's going on with this. So I think we're all trying to search for our tribe. I mean, it's anthropologic, right? I mean, from the very cave days, you had your family unit. The father went off and went and slayed the saber-toothed tiger. The mom's got her brood, and when you don't have that, you're just searching for it. It was interesting when in my high school yearbook, we have your little quotes or whatever, and I stole a little saying from a song that Queen had done back in the day, and I put it together with something I did. The Queen part was all through the years. In the end, it appears there was never really anyone but me, and it was sort of like I'm alone on an island. Even back then, at 17, I'm just gonna have to survive on my own because I'm always gonna kind of be on my own. And ever thought that was so weird, or like, and I really in my bones felt that, and I still feel that.
Lori, with the caveat that I understand that this is not a necessarily an area of expertise, but I think you have some interesting perspective from your research on your, doing your book. And so one of the thoughts I had was, there's a whole group of people in the world who are in a situation where they've had to find, create, establish their own families, right? So it wasn't so much a situation of being, abandoned or any kind of adoption trauma, but just maybe a situation where the family that they were born into ended up not being the right fit for whatever reason. So they've had to create a new family unit for themselves. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, from the research you did in your book, what insights you might offer people who are on a journey where maybe they're having to create their own family.
I have a little tile in my kitchen that says friends are the family you get to choose. So that's been something that I've done, and lots of people do. In fact, I've been obviously talking to lots of people about the book, and they may not have, an adoption connection, but they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm estranged from XYZ." I think it feels like, and I'm making this up a little bit now, but I think we're at a stage in the evolution of society where people know how to put boundaries in place. They don't have to just accept the way things are, like, say, the baby boomers did. I think there's a lot more independent thinking. There's a lot more courage out there to say, no, I don't have to be in that family situation. It's not serving me well and it's not healthy for me. Therapy, thank goodness, is okay, right? I mean, I think anybody who doesn't have a therapist doesn't know what they're missing, I mean, it's just no, there's good and not great therapists out there too, but I just think we're in a phase of the evolution of life that it's okay to have that introspection and self-reflection, and that it's, I think, rewarded in many ways. So it's okay to like step out there and just say, no, that family unit is not helping me be at my best, and I'm going to go and make my own.
Now, there's something interesting you just said there, Laura. You were talking about the shifts in our society and how boundaries and, all of these things are now in place. And so, as I was sort of just reviewing all of your materials, there also seemed to be a bit of a generational component. And I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to that, because you did at the beginning mention that, you were born at a different time. And then, even within the generation, the evolution within the generations as it comes to adoption are changing. And so, I don't know if you have anything else you could speak to regarding that topic.
Well, clearly, those being adopted now, or have been, say, in the last 15 years, 20 years or so, maybe even a little more, they've got a lot more available to them. There's a lot more information out there that just nobody talked about it in my generation and the generations before. It's just always a secret. But I think now, because there's been, social media has been a wonderful outlet for, hashtag adoptee. There's countless people now doing podcasts and writing their memoirs and getting the story out there. So the awareness now is getting is big. Like, I feel like my book came out right kind of in the middle of this wave, right? There was those who came before us, and Heffron is an author that wrote You Don't Look Adopted. That was maybe 7 years ago. But that really has just been in the last, less than 10 years that people are out there talking about it. Now it's a common topic. So I do think that, the generations are, millennials, Gen Zs, they're brave. They've been connecting with the world from the beginning. That's a whole different mindset than when I grew up. I mean, I had dial phones. Come on. So I think all of that and just technology has enabled this topic to get discussed at bigger levels, and it should.
Because you have so many, we'll call them identities within the adoption space, Lori. I mean, you were adopted, you have adopted, so you have a daughter who you adopted. And then, of course, all of these other identities that you've sort of picked up in this sphere as you've been moving through. I'm just curious how your own experiences and perspective really shaped the narratives that are in adoption songs.
Yeah, adoption songs was a 5-year project, so it changed drastically. In fact, my daughter, who is my editor, was rightfully a little frustrated with me because I once we were getting towards the end, I'm like, "Oh, I just found this out. Oh my gosh, I have to learn more about this." We would be remiss if we did not include this in the book. So, the last 6 months or so, I added a lot of the whole intro and outro wasn't even a thought because it was all new information to me. However, what I loved in retrospect, as I had to then proof the book, multiple times, it was in there. That trauma was in there, in those stories, in those tracks. Go with the music theme for the most part. And I didn't ask about it, right? Because today, if I were to do it, and I am looking to do adoption songs too, I would be asking, have you noticed, or what have you noticed about that? Now, what I mentioned earlier, the fog, that's where, you're still in this like, oh, adoption's great. There's a couple of people that, have not experienced any of that anxiety or that trauma that are in the book. That's just not been their story. They haven't thought about it. One of the people in the book later is like, you know what? It's so interesting now that I know about it. So then they call it coming out of the fog, right? Where then somebody else made an acronym: fear, obligation, guilt, or grief, where, you want to respect your adopted parents because, they were good to you, or, hopefully not always. So, you're kind of afraid to say anything, because we were all told not to. And then there's this obligation of respect and, keeping whatever that family image or identity is that isn't necessarily yours, but it's, everybody wants it to become yours. And then that guilt of like, oh, I can't say anything, or the grief of, you know what, I have a loss. My birth mother relinquished me. There's another concept called birthday trauma that was new to me that I include in the book, where the last time I ever was with my birth mother was on my birthday. And I never realized it, but I kinda sabotaged my birthday. My parents were lovely, I was an only child, they were older, so, they had some disposable income, and we'd travel and do fun things, and I had a good life. I always just had this weird thing on my birthday where I'd be like, "Oh," and I noticed it in my daughter, and my daughter's 17th birthday was in December, and I didn't know about birthday trauma until about a week later. And we took her to Broadway. We had a great, great weekend with a dear friend, and she was just miserable. She was sad. I'm like, "What's the matter? We just had this fantastic weekend." She had birthday trauma because last time she was with her birth mother was on her birthday. And there's just that inherent in our tissues, right? That we can't explain and didn't know. but it all made all the sense in the world.
What advice would you give to adoptees who are searching for their identity and seeking to move beyond the limitations they might feel?
Yeah. So, what's out there now are wonderful retreats. There are adoption coaches or adoption trauma informed therapists. I know Psychology Today has a very substantial list of, and that's a fairly new discipline, adoption trauma informed. There are trauma informed therapists and coaches, of course. That's the little caveat. And in fact, my niece is a psychologist, and she forwarded to me a podcast from an adoption trauma informed therapist. I was like, oh, that's brilliant. So I see that that is becoming an area of specialty that's getting much more attention. So that's, I think, fantastic news for those of us who are coming out of the fog and need support. I'm working with a colleague now in designing something, pathways for hope and healing. So a segment workshop, virtual, to really help people with understanding their values and getting grounded in themselves and helping create their playlist, a little tie back to the book, because music is such a universal theme and it can be very healing, and there can be kind of that acknowledgement of songs that represent kind of the hurt, but then represent where you are now and represent where you want to be and where you want to head. So, that's the great news, is that there are intentional strategies and practices that we can go and find, and they're becoming much more easily, available now than there was even 5 years ago.
Now, Lori, one of the things that I like to talk about on this podcast is that connection between the personal and the professional. And while writing a book certainly is a professional endeavor, I'm curious, as someone who's in a helping profession like coaching, what connections you see between this history of being an adoptee, of adopting, and then being in a helping profession. Like, do you see any connections between this personal experience that you've had to your professional
Mhm.
endeavors?
I think as an executive coach, because of course, as I know, we're all about creating the future, not about trying to heal the past. I'm not qualified as a therapist and I don't want to be. However, having that knowledge, right? I think I can pick up on my clients' hurts, maybe that they don't even know, where I might be able to help guide them towards getting some additional support so that they can create. I mean, I coach a lot of women in a large tech company out west, and it's so stressful right now. AI has just blown the roof off of, and they're just so competitive. They're all burned out. A lot of them are working moms, and they're trying to have that balance. So yeah, I think I can relate to them in certain ways, and at least recognize the difference between just stress and maybe anxiety, and maybe even something deeper, which is trauma, because trauma does manifest itself a little differently than just basic stress. So I do see that I think it's helped me be a more effective coach for my clients, and really I'm all about serving my clients and being there for them and helping them find their best next life or even day.
Well, Lori, we are approaching the end of the show, and I love to wrap each episode by asking, if someone said this episode was way too long, I did not listen, what is the one thing that you'd want them to take away from our conversation?
I want the conversation to extend beyond these podcasts, to have the awareness of that adoptees have a different experience, and no one really asks them what it is. So ask an adoptee, what was it like to be adopted, and where are you and how are you and how can I help you?
And a great place to start is by reading adoption songs. So, Lori, on that note, thank you so much for being on the show today.
You're great, Heather. Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode and are seeking to redefine success on your own terms, subscribe to Small Acts of Rebellion and join a community that celebrates authenticity and personal growth.